She was 26 the day the railway company finished buying her valley. The land agent laughed as he read the schedule aloud. She had no field left, no cart, no horse, no cottage in her own name, and no man in the world who would speak for her at a bank. She had one thing, her father's iron-burning rake, 4 feet of it, the grip worn bright by a hand that had been 30 years at the kilns. The company paid her £11 for the ground and left her the old lime kilns above the cut, because nobody believed dead kilns could feed a living woman. But what Edwin Sloane did not know was that in the north face of that quarry, 11 feet above the floor, under a shelf of pale rubble, there was something that would change not only what Clara Wren was worth, but what the whole valley could charge. Tell me in the comments if anyone ever handed you a thing they were certain was worthless. Clara Wren had learned her whole trade from a man who never wrote a word of it down, which is the reason nobody in the valley believed she had a trade at all. Her father was Josiah Wren, lime burner, of Rag Hill above the village of Chalcombe in Somerset, and he had been burning stone on that hill since he was 14 years old. His own father had burned it before him in the same 2 kilns, which were cut back into the bank so that a cart could tip straight in at the top, while a man raked out at the bottom. Josiah was 58 when he died in the February of 1866, of what the doctor called a congestion of the lungs, and what the men at the works called the lime. He had been coughing white for 11 years. He worked until the 8th of the month, and he died on the 19th, in the back room of the cottage, with the window open because he wanted the air off the hill. Clara's mother, Hannah, had died 7 years before that, in the summer of '59, when a fever came along the cottages by the River Yo and took 4 people in 9 days. Hannah had a sister in Bristol who was supposed to have married a man in the leather trade. No letter ever came from her, before the funeral or after it, and Clara grew up knowing the woman's name and nothing else in the world about her. So the child was at the kilns from the time she could carry the tea can up the track without spilling it, which was at about 5, and she was sorting stone on the bank at 9. That is where the education began, though nobody in Chalcombe would have called it one. Her father would set 2 blocks in front of her, one pale and dry-looking, one darker and closer in the grain, and he would have her strike each of them with the small hammer and tell him what she heard. The white stone answered high and short. The blue answered lower, and it went on ringing a moment after the blow, and it broke with a cleaner face when it broke at all. He taught her the color at the kiln eye, which is how a burner knows what is happening inside a fire he cannot see. He taught her that lime is not made, it is watched, and that the watching is the whole of the skill. He taught her the smell of a draw that had gone too far, and the different smell of one pulled short. He taught her to slake a handful in a saucer of water and count while it took, and to put her palm above it without touching, because good fat lime from the white stone came on hot and quick and would blister a hand that stayed too long. He told her one other thing, over and over, for years, and she thought at the time that it was only a caution about blasting. Not every stone on Rag Hill burns alike, he said. There is stone up there that wants a different fire, and if you ever come to it, do not treat it as you treat the rest. She was 11 or 12 when she first heard it. She heard it perhaps 100 times after that, and never once thought to ask him which stone he meant, in the way that children never ask the questions that will matter later. In the October of the year she turned 18, Josiah had a bad week with his chest, and Clara drew the north kiln alone, from the setting of the fire to the raking out, for 2 days and a night. When it was done and the lime lay cooling in the shed, he came up the track and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he went into the tool house and brought out his own rake, 4 feet of iron with a grip his hand had polished bright, and he put it into her hands and said, "Never sell a stone you have not burned." He made himself a new one that winter out of a broken harrow tine, and it was never as good, and he complained about it until the year he died. Her name was on nothing. The bills went out headed Josiah Wren, lime burner, Rag Hill, because that was what the customers expected to see, and Clara wrote them out herself in a clerk's hand she had taught herself from a copybook that had belonged to the schoolmaster's daughter. She kept the accounts from the age of 22. She knew what every mason in 3 parishes owed and how long each of them took to pay it. In the spring of '63, a builder named Mr. Bewley came out from Wells to buy 40 bushels for a barn wall. He wanted to know how the last draw had gone, and Clara told him, because she was standing there and her father was not. Bewley heard her out. Then he waited until Josiah came round the corner of the shed, and he asked him the same question in the same words, and took the same answer from him, and wrote it in his book. Josiah said nothing at all about it afterwards. Neither did Clara. She went in and got the tea. By the time the surveyors came up the valley with their poles and their chains, there were only 2 people left alive who knew what the Rag Hill stone would do, and one of them was in the churchyard at Chalcombe under a slab his daughter had paid for by the shilling. The Somerset and Wiltshire Junction Railway had been talked about in Chalcombe for 4 years before anybody saw a man from it. Then in the March after Josiah died, 3 men came along the lane with a theodolite and a chain and a boy to carry the arrows, and they drove painted stakes across the lower fields without asking anybody. The act had been through Parliament in the August previous, and the line was already drawn on paper in London. The valley was a good line for them. It ran nearly level for 2 miles along the Yeo, and the ground rose on both sides in limestone. The only difficulty in the whole length was the wet at the bottom, where the river had spread out over the years into a black soft ground that the farmers called the moor and used only for late grazing. The engineers proposed to carry the line across it on an embankment with a culvert under, and to bridge the river twice, and to cut into the hill below Rag Hill for 140 yards. The buying began in April, and it was done by a land agent named Edwin Sloane, who came out from Bristol on the Tuesday coach and put up at the Bell. He was a tidy man of about 40 with a leather case and a printed form, and he was never once rude to anybody in Chalcombe. He would sit at a kitchen table with his hat on his knee and explain that the company had power to take the land whether the owner sold or not. The owner might have the price now by agreement, or have it in 18 months by arbitration after paying a surveyor and a solicitor out of his own pocket. Nearly all of them took it now. Samuel Gay, 51, who kept 2 carts and a yard by the bridge, sold his home close and his orchard in the same week, and told everybody he had done well out of it. Clara had 2 acres and a rood in the bottom, which her father had bought in 52 out of a good year, and the cottage at the foot of the track, and the works on the hill. The 2 acres were in the line. The cottage was not in the line, but the company wanted the frontage for their haul road, and the haul road was where the cottage stood. Sloane came up on the 11th of June. He had the schedule with him, and the schedule is the paper this whole story turns on, though nobody in the room that day thought so. It was printed in columns, and it listed every parcel by number, with a description and a valuation, and against each one a note of what the company proposed. Number 41 was the 2 acres and a rood of meadow, £8. Number 42 was the cottage and garden, £3 for the interest she held in it, which was less than it should have been, and she knew it. Number 43 was the last line on the sheet. He read it out to her because it was his practice to read the whole schedule aloud, so that nobody could say afterwards that they had not been told. Number 43, he said. Limeworks and quarry at Rag Hill with kilns, shed and appurtenances disused. And then he read the valuation column, which had no figure in it, only 4 words that some clerk in an office in Bristol had written across the space, of no marketable value. He laughed when he read it. It was not a cruel laugh, and that was somehow worse, because it was the laugh of a man sharing a small joke about a third party who happened not to be present, except that she was present, and the third party was her father. The company does not propose to take number 43, he said. We would be at the cost of carting it away, and there is nothing there to cart. You may keep it, Miss Wren, with our compliments. She signed on the 17th. The money came in a canvas bag from the bank at Wells, £11 in silver and gold. She counted it twice on the table and wrote the sum on the flyleaf of her father's receipt book in pencil and tied the tape and put it in a tin box that had held tea. She did not open the bag again that night. On the 29th of September, the men came for the cottage roof, and she carried out the bed, the table, 2 chairs, the receipt book, the tin box, her mother's plates, and her father's rake. Then she went up the track to Rag Hill to live in a lime shed, because there was nowhere else in the parish that belonged to her. So here is the question worth sitting with. Before we go up that hill, if those kilns were truly dead, and the quarry truly worked out, why had Josiah Wren spent 30 years telling his daughter that there was stone on Rag Hill which must never be treated like the rest? Clara asked herself that on the first morning, standing in the yard in the rain, and the answer was somewhere in the north face, under 11 feet of pale rubble, that her father had shoveled there himself. The works had been standing idle for 2 years and 4 months, which is not long in the life of a building, and is a very long time in the life of a lime kiln. There were 2 of them, cut into the bank at the top of the yard, with the loading platform above and the drawing arches below. The north kiln was the older, put up by her grandfather in the 1820s, round in the pot and lined with fire brick that had been renewed twice. The south kiln was newer by 30 years and had never drawn as well, because whoever built it had made the eye too wide, and her father had spent his whole working life complaining about a fault he had not committed. Both arches were black. The soot on a kiln does not weather off. It goes into the stone and stays, and after 2 years of rain, the arches at Rag Hill looked exactly as they had looked on the last day of burning, which was the strangest thing about the place. Everything else had gone over. The cart track from the lane was under nettles to the height of her waist, and the ruts had hardened and filled and were only findable with a foot. The loading shelter had lost the western half of its roof in the gale of the previous January, and the fallen slates lay in the grass in a line. There was a coil of chain by the platform that had rusted into one solid piece. There were 7 iron rings set into the wall for tying, and 4 of them would still turn. In the sheltered corner behind the tool house, out of the weather, the white dust still lay in the cracks of the paving as fine and dry as the day it had settled, and when she put her thumb in it, it took her thumbprint. The quarry face went back from the yard in a curve about 90 feet across and perhaps 30 high at the deepest, and it was a mess. The last 2 years of working had been all pale stone, and the floor was covered in the waste of it, broken pieces the size of a fist and smaller, grown over in places with willow herb. Anybody standing in that yard would have said the same thing as the clerk in Bristol had written, and most of them said it out loud. Mrs. Joan Pell, who was 48 and had kept the shop at Chalcombe since her husband drowned in the Yeo in '57, came up the track on the second day with half a loaf and a jar of dripping and a great deal of practical advice. There was work at the collar factory at Shepton, she said. There was a place going in service at the rectory at Ditcheat, and the family were said to be fair. There was no shame in either. What there was shame in she did not say, but she looked at the black arches while she did not say it, and then she looked at the shed where Clara had put the bed. They gave you the ruins because it would cost them money to take them away, Mrs. Pell said. That is the whole of it, my dear. There is no kindness in a company. I know it, Clara said. Well then, said Mrs. Pell. Others came and were less kind about it. Ellen Vowles, who was 19 and worked in the dairy at Fern Farm, walked up with her sister on a Sunday to look, in the way that people go and look at a house that has burned. Old Sarah Dando, who was 72 and had a bad knee she had described to everyone in the parish, said that her father had carried lime off that hill in the year of the great snow. The stone had been finished then, she said, and if it was finished in 1814 it was not likely to have grown back. Clara let them talk. She had been up on the bank the first evening with a lantern, and she had walked the whole face of the quarry with her hand on the rock, and what she saw when she looked at Rag Hill was not what the parish saw. She saw that the yard was sound under the weeds, because her grandfather had paved it. She saw that the north kiln stood plumb and had no crack running through the pot, which is the one fault that kills a kiln outright. She saw that the waste on the floor was all pale stone, which meant that the last 2 years of her father's working had been in the west end and the top benches, and that the north face at the far corner had not been touched since she was a girl of about 14. She had a rake, 4 chairs worth of firewood, 11 pounds, and the memory of a man saying that not every stone on that hill burned alike. She began on the track, because there is no trade at a Limeworks without a way in, and she began on the 5th of October with a reaping hook and a mattock. It took 9 days. The nettles came off easy enough, and the labor was in the ruts, which had to be filled and rolled, or no loaded cart would ever come up in wet weather without going into the axle. She got the fill from the quarry floor, which was covered in exactly the sort of pale broken waste that makes good hard core, and she barrowed it down 220 yards in loads that she cut back to half a barrow by the 4th day because the full ones were beating her. She hired a boy on the 2nd week. His name was Nathaniel Hicks. He was 15, the 4th of 7 children of a hedger at Wick Bottom, and he came at 8 pence a day and a plate of bread and dripping at noon, which was a penny under the going rate for a boy, and was what she could pay. He was worth twice it. He never spoke unless spoken to, and sometimes not then. Then the kiln. She and the boy stripped the north kiln to the brick, which meant getting out the old charge that had been left in it, 2 years of soaked ash and half-burned rubbish that had set into a crust across the eye. That took 4 days, and it was the filthiest work either of them ever did. Under it the lining was better than she had feared. 11 fire bricks were gone at the throat, where the heat is worst, and she took them out with a cold chisel and set 11 new ones with a clay and lime mortar mixed on the platform. She got the bricks from Bunn's yard at Evercreech at 4 shillings and 6 pence the dozen, which is a price she remembered for the rest of her life because it was the first money she spent out of the tin. She spent, in the 6 weeks of October and November, £3 2 shillings and 4 pence, firebrick 4 and 6, a hundredweight of small coal 6 shillings, carried up by Samuel Gay for nothing, because he said his horse was going up that way empty. A new handle for the mattock. Nails 2 shillings to the blacksmith at Chalcombe, Cyrus Bell, who was 64, for freeing the drawing bar and putting a new eye in the pick. 8 pence a day to the boy, 6 days a week, which came to 19 shillings and 4 pence over the period, and every penny of it entered in the receipt book in pencil, in a column headed with the date. She kept nothing back for the winter, and she knew what she was doing when she chose not to. The first burn was on the 18th of November, and it was a small one, 30 bushels, all pale stone off the west end, set in the old way with a bed of coal at the bottom, and stone and fuel in layers above. She set the fire at 4 in the afternoon, and she watched it all night from a stool in the arch with a sack over her shoulders. That is the part nobody sees. A kiln is not a machine you start and leave. It breathes, and the draft changes with the wind, and the man or woman at the eye is reading a fire through a hole the size of a hand and deciding, hour by hour, whether to open the damper or close it. At about 2 in the morning, the color at the eye came up to the pale straw that her father had called ready, and she held it there, and at 7 she began to draw. The lime came out white and clean, and it hissed in the slaking trough and threw off heat so hard that she had to stand back, and it fell to a smooth putty in under 4 minutes. It was good lime. It was as good as any that had ever come off Rag Hill. It was also worth almost nothing, and she knew that too. That was the difficulty, and it is worth setting out plainly, because it is the reason the whole valley believed the works were finished. Ordinary lime from ordinary white stone is a cheap thing. It is made everywhere there is limestone, which in that part of Somerset is everywhere. A farmer will buy it for his land and a builder will buy it for his mortar, and the price is set by the cost of carting it, so that a burner 5 miles nearer to the customer will always beat you. Rag Hill had lost its trade before ever the railway came, because a bigger works at Croscombe had gone in with 3 kilns and a proper weighbridge and was selling at 9 pence the bushel delivered. Josiah Wren could not make it and deliver it for 9 pence, and that was the end of the argument. Clara sold her 30 bushels to a farmer at Stone Easton for £1 and 2 pence, and had to cart it herself in a borrowed trap in 2 loads, and when she had paid for the coal and the boy, she had cleared about 7 shillings for a fortnight's work. She sat in the shed that night with the receipt book open and did the figures 3 times, and the figures said the same thing each time. She could work like that until she was 50 and never do more than eat. Whatever was going to save Rag Hill, it was not white lime. The memory came back to her in December, and it came back the way those things do, sideways and at the wrong moment. She was clearing waste off the quarry floor to get room for a stack, and she took a barrow to the far corner under the north face because it was the only place in the yard where nothing was stored. The heap there was old. Willowherb had been growing on it for years and had died back with the frost, and under the dead stalks the pieces were pale and weathered soft and slid when she put the shovel in. She had shifted about a third of it when the shovel went through into something different, and a lump came out onto the floor at her feet that was not the color of anything else in that corner. It was blue, not blue as the sky is blue, but the flat blue-gray of a slate that has been wet, darker at the fresh break than on the face, and heavier in the hand than a piece of that size had any business being. She turned it over twice. The break was clean and almost flat, without the sugary crumbling edge that white lias gives, and there was a fine dark seam running through it like a pencil line. She sat down on the barrow with the piece in her lap, and she was still sitting there when the light went. It was not that she had never seen the stone before. She had seen it 100 times as a child, on the bank, in her father's hand, and it was one of the 2 blocks he used to set in front of her for the hammer test. It was that she had never once put the 2 things together. There is stone up there that wants a different fire. He had said it, and she had heard it as an old man's caution about blasting the face, and she had let him die without asking him one plain question about it. The next morning she went back with a lantern and a pick, before the boy came, and she cleared the whole corner down to the rock. What was underneath was the reason her father had shoveled his waste into that spot for the last 10 years of his life, though whether he had done it to hide the place or only because it was handy, she was never afterwards sure. Above the floor, at a height of about 11 feet, there was a shelf where the face stepped back, and the shelf was choked with pale rubble that had come down off the top benches. Under the lip of it, where the rubble had kept the weather off, a band of the blue stone ran out of the face and went on into the hill. She measured it that afternoon with a folding rule. It was 14 inches thick at the thickest, and it thinned to about 9 at the western end, and it showed for 22 feet, before it went under the rubble at both ends and could not be followed. 14 inches. In a face 30 feet high, in a quarry 90 feet across, in a hill that had been worked for 60 years, one band the thickness of a man's forearm. She understood then how it had been missed, and there was no mystery in it at all once she saw the shape of the thing. Her grandfather had worked the floor of the quarry and the lower benches. Her father had gone up and west, into the good easy pale stone, because that was what the trade wanted, and it came out cheaper. The blue band lay above the old working, and below the new one, on a shelf you could not see from the yard, and the pale waste came down over it every time anybody worked the top. The surveyors from the railway had walked the yard twice in the spring. They had been valuing a root across a valley, and to a man valuing a root, a quarry face is a bank of earth that may or may not stand up. She went down to Chelcombe on the Saturday and asked Mrs. Pell whether her father had ever spoken to her about bluestone. Mrs. Pell said that Josiah Wren had spoken to nobody about anything for the last 3 years of his life, and that grief made people hear things, and that there was still a place going at the rectory at Ditcheat. Clara did not argue. She went back up the hill and got out 14 pieces of the blue stone with a pick and a wedge, and broke each one and looked at the break, and set them in a row on the platform under the roof to dry. What she meant to do next was the thing that killed her first attempt entirely, and she did it because she was sure she already knew the answer. She burned the first batch of blue stone on the 9th of January, and she ruined it. There was no great error of judgment in it, only confidence. She had been burning lime since she was a girl, and she knew what a full burn looked like. So she set the blue stone in the north kiln in the way she set everything, with a good bed of coal and the layers close, and she took it up to the straw color at the eye and held it there for 11 hours. Her father would have told her, in about 4 words, exactly what would happen. Nobody told her, because there was nobody left to tell her, and that is the difference between having a trade and having a teacher. What came out of the arch was not lime. It came out gray and dense, and part of it had run together at the edges into a hard, slaggy mass with a glassy shine on the broken face, and when she put a handful in the trough it lay in the water and did nothing at all. She waited an hour. It sat there. She broke a lump with the hammer and put the fresh face under, and it sat there too, sullen and cold, and by evening the water had gone cloudy and the stone had not changed in any way that she could see. She dumped the whole of it, 31 bushels of it, over the edge of the tip, and it cost her 4 shillings of coal, and 2 days of the boy's time, and the best part of her nerve. For 3 days after that, she did not go near the north face. She cut firewood, and she mended the west end of the shelter with the slates that had come off it, and she reglazed 2 broken panes in the tool-house window, with glass at 4p a pane from Wells. She was, in the plainest sense, waiting to stop feeling foolish. On the 4th day she got the receipt book and went back over her father's old entries, which was the thing she should have done first. He had kept the book badly, in a working hand, with prices and names and nothing else, and it went back to 1849. She read it right through twice, and in among 400 entries for bushels of lime at 7p and 8p and 9p, she found 11 that were different. They were spread over 9 years, the earliest in 54 and the last in 61. They were all small, none above 20 bushels. They were all at 2 shillings and 6p the bushel, which was more than 3 times his ordinary price. And against each of them he had written the same 2 words, in the same shorthand, as though it were a kind of goods that any fool would recognize. Wet work, 2 shillings and 6p. She sat with her finger on the line for a long time. She burned the second batch on the 22nd of January, and this time she went at it as though she knew nothing, which is a harder thing to do than it sounds. She set the kiln lighter on fuel. She never let the color at the eye come up past a dull red, and when it wanted to run away from her in the small hours, she closed the damper down and held it back, and she drew after 7 hours instead of 11. The stone that came out was gray and rough and looked, to anybody who had ever seen good lime, like a failure. She took a handful into the shed and put it in a saucer of water and held her palm above it and waited. Nothing came for a minute and a half. Then the surface of it went slowly dark, and it began to swell, and it broke apart with a sound so small she had to put her ear down to it. It gave off a heat that was there, and was nothing like the fierce heat of the white lime, so that she could have kept her hand over it all night. It took 11 minutes to do what fat lime does in 4. When it was finished, it was not a smooth putty. It was a coarse sandy stuff with hard grains through it that would not break down however long she left them, and by every rule she had been taught, that was a poor lime and a badly burned one. She made 2 quarts of it into putty anyway, and left it in a covered pail. And she went to bed. In the morning the pail had set solid. Not stiff. Solid, all through, hard enough that she had to dig it out with the point of the trowel, and she had left it under a lid where no air could reach it, and fat lime under a lid will keep soft for a year and a day. She stood in the doorway of the shed with the pail in her 2 hands, and she did not say anything, because there was nobody there, and the only sound on the hill was the wind and the men down in the bottom driving the piles for the river bridge. She still did not know what she had. She knew what she had to find out, and there was only one man in the parish who could tell her whether she was right or whether grief had got into her after all. Thomas Reeve was 61 and had been a mason since he was 13, and he had built or repaired most of the walls in Chalcombe that were worth the trouble of building. He had also known Josiah Wren for 40 years and had carried the coffin. When Clara came down the hill on the last Saturday in January and asked him to come up and look at something, he said he would come on the Monday, and the tone he said it in told her exactly what he expected to find. He came up at 11 and stood in the yard with his hands behind his back and let her talk. She showed him the band in the north face, and he said it was a thin band. She showed him the second burn, and he took a pinch of it and rubbed it between finger and thumb and said it was underburned and she had wasted her coal. She showed him the pail that had gone solid under the lid, and he stopped talking. He turned the lump over twice. He put his thumbnail into it, which is what masons do, and the nail did not mark it. "Where did you leave this?" he said. "In the shed," she said. "Under the lid." 9 days. He put it down on the platform and looked at the black arch of the north kiln for a while and did not say anything else about grief. They did the test on the 4th of February, and it was Reeve's test, not hers, and it was the oldest test there is. She made up 2 mortars on the platform in the cold, one of ordinary white lime from her November burn and one of the blue, each with the same sand out of the same heap, gauged as near as she could judge by the same measure. She rolled each of them into a ball about the size of an apple. Reeve wrote the date on a slate. Then they put both balls into a wooden bucket of water out of the Yo and set the bucket in the corner of the tool house where it would not freeze, and Reeve went home, and Clara went back to cutting a road up to the shelf. They looked at it on the 13th. The white lime ball had gone. There was a soft gray slurry lying in the bottom of the bucket where it had been, and the water above it was milky, and when Reeve put his hand in and closed it on the mess, it went through his fingers. The blue ball was where they had left it. He lifted it out, in 2 pieces. "That is water lime," Reeve said. He sat down on the platform edge, which was a thing he did not usually do, and he told her what he knew, which was not geology and was better than geology. He had worked with the stuff twice in his life. There was lime like that came out of the ground over at Watchet, and there was more of it carted round from Wales, and it cost the earth by the time it reached the middle of Somerset because it was heavy and it came a long way. It went into wells and cisterns and the bottom courses of anything that stood in water. Ordinary lime in wet ground was a waste of a man's labor, he said, because it never set at all where the damp could get to it, and it washed out of the joints in the first winter, and any builder who told a customer otherwise was a rogue. Then he asked her the question she had not yet let herself ask. "How much of it is up there?" he said. She did not know. She knew 14 inches at the thickest and 22 feet of face, and she knew that the band went into the hill and nobody alive had ever followed it. Down in the bottom of the valley that same week, 300 men were driving an embankment across the moor, and the culvert that was to carry the drainage under it was going up in ordinary lime mortar bought at 9p the bushel from the works at Croscombe. It rained through the whole of March, and the moor did what the moor had always done, which was to take the water off 2 hills and hold it. The culvert under the embankment was a good piece of work to look at, 6 feet in the arch, with wing walls and a paved invert, and it had been built through the winter by men who knew their business. In the second week of March, the water came up through it in a way the engineers had not allowed for, and it stayed up for 9 days. When it went down, there was a foreman standing in the invert with a bar, and he could put that bar into the joints of the lower courses up to the length of his hand. The mortar had not set. It had never set. It had been washing out of the work as fast as they laid it, and above the culvert there was an embankment 90,000 cubic yards deep waiting to be tipped on top of it. Matthew Hargreaves came down from the contractor's office at Frome to see it. He was 38, an engineer by training, and he had the two habits that made him different from every other man the company sent into that valley, which were that he looked at things himself and that he asked questions of whoever happened to be standing nearest. What he was told was that hydraulic lime could be had from Watchet by rail and road at a delivered price he did not want to pay, in quantities that would not arrive until June, and that there was nothing nearer. Thomas Reeve was setting a wall for the company at the river bridge that fortnight. He mentioned, in the way a man mentions a thing he has already decided to mention, that he had put a ball of mortar in a bucket of water in February, and it had come out hard, and that the lime had been burned 3/4 of a mile away by Josiah Wren's daughter. Hargreaves came up Rag Hill on the 11th of April with a canvas bag and no hat. He asked to see the face, and she took him up the road she had cut to the shelf, and he stood there for 20 minutes, and put his hand flat on the band and said almost nothing. He asked for a stone. She gave him 3. He asked what she could burn in a week, and she said from the one kiln, about 200 bushels, and he wrote it down. Then he did his own test with his own men at Frome, and did not come back for 9 days, and when he came back he brought Edwin Sloane. Sloane had his leather case. He was not rude. He stood in a yard he had valued at nothing 11 months before, and told her that the company was prepared to make her an offer for the property, given the awkwardness of a small holding lying against their works. There was the state of the buildings to consider, he said, and the age of the kilns, and the very small extent of the material. They were prepared to go to £35 for the whole, which was a great deal more than the place had ever been worth to anybody. He said it as though she were being given something. Clara had thought about this for 3 weeks, mostly at night, and what she had decided was that she would not raise her voice, and she would not explain herself, because a woman who explains is a woman still asking permission. She said that she was not selling the works. She said that she would sell lime, by the bushel, delivered to the company's stage at the bottom of the track, at 2 shillings and 9 the bushel, and that the first order must be for no fewer than 800 bushels, and that she would want it in writing. Sloane laughed for the second time in the story, and it was shorter than the first. 9 days later, 3 things happened in the same week. Reuben Coles, 34, who had agreed to cart for her and had taken her earnest of 2 shillings, sent his brother up to say that he could not oblige her after all, and did not give a reason, and was seen from that Friday carting timber for the company at a good rate. A gate went up across the Hall Road at the foot of Rag Hill Lane, on the company's land, with a padlock, and a man to say that it was for the safety of the works. And a letter came from Bristol offering £40 for the property, and stating that the company would otherwise obtain its lime elsewhere. She sat down that night with the tin box and the receipt book and the schedule she had signed in the June of the year before. She read it for the first time since Sloane had read it out to her, right through, all 4 sheets of it, including the printed conditions at the back that nobody ever reads. Number 43 had been excluded from the purchase. It had been excluded whole, with the words the clerk had written, with kilns, shed and appurtenances, and the conveyance of number 42 carried a reservation, in the ordinary printed form, of all ways and watercourses belonging to any land of the vendor not thereby conveyed. Her father's cart had gone up and down that track to the lane since 1822. The company had bought the ground under the road. They had not bought the way over it, because their own clerk had written her works out of the schedule as worth nothing, and a thing worth nothing does not get its rights read carefully. She took the schedule to a solicitor at Wells named Mr. Aldridge and paid him 15 shillings, which was more than a fortnight of the boy's wages, and Mr. Aldridge read it and told her she was right and wrote 1 letter. The gate was open on the Thursday. Hargreaves came up on the Friday with a form of contract, and he came alone, and he had the grace to look at the ground for a moment before he began. They settled it on the platform outside the north kiln, sitting on the coping, with the paper on his knee. 2 shillings and 9 the bushel, delivered to the stage. 800 bushels before the 1st of August, and a further 1,200 at the company's option before the end of October. Payment monthly and not in kind. The cartway acknowledged in writing over the company's land, and one condition that was hers, and that she had thought of a long time before any of the others, which was that the men she took on to work the quarry and draw the kilns would be men out of the valley, named by her, and that the company would have no voice in it whatever. Hargreaves read the last clause twice, and then wrote it in. "My father's rule was never sell a stone you have not burned, Mr. Sloane," she said, when the agent came up the following week to countersign. "You never burned this one." Sloane signed and did not answer. He was not a man who wasted words on a position he had already lost. The south kiln was lit again on the 2nd of June, for the first time since her father had drawn it in the September of '63, and it went badly for 2 days because the eye was too wide. She took on 6 men. Thomas Reeve's nephew, William Reeve, 28, to work the face with a bar and wedges, because the band would not stand blasting and every foot of it came out by hand. Samuel Gay and his 2 carts. 2 brothers named Hicks, one of them, the boy Nathaniel, now on a man's wage of 2 shillings and 3 pence a day, which was more than the company paid its own laborers, and Cyrus Bell, 64, who gave up the forge at Chalcombe 3 days a week to keep her tools and her wagon irons in order, and who was heard to say in the Bell that he had known that stone was there all along, which was not true and nobody minded. They sent down 840 bushels by the 29th of July. The company took the further 1,200 in September and another 600 in the spring following, and by then there was an order from a builder at Bath for cistern work and 2 more from further off, and the ledger she kept was headed Clara Wren, lime burner, Rag Hill, in her own hand, because she wrote it herself and there was nobody left to tell her not to. Edwin Sloane came up the track once more, on the 14th of September, on his way to some other business in the valley. The yard he walked into had 2 kilns drawing, a stack of blue stone 8 feet high under the mended shelter, 4 men on the face and the boy at the trough, and Samuel Gay's second cart coming up the road he had padlocked in the spring. Clara was on the platform with the rake, reading the eye of the north kiln, and she saw him and did not come down. He stood by the gate for about a minute and a half. Then he touched his hat to her and went away down the hill, and he never came to Rag Hill again. The culvert under the moor was taken down to the invert that summer and rebuilt in her mortar. It carried the water off 2 hills for 119 years, and it was still standing when they lifted the rails. Clara Wren was 26 years old, with a dead trade, a roofless cottage, a shed to sleep in and 11 pounds in a tea tin, when the railway company handed her the one thing in the valley they were certain had no value in it. She never broke into the 11 pounds. It went into the bank at Wells in the November of '67, and it was still there when she died. And of all the money that ever passed through her hands, that was the only sum she kept whole, because there was no other way to hold on to what it had bought her.